All right, welcome to a short talk on open source software and public policy, what you or what a country can do to help its economy, in particular, but not exclusively, through the use or support of open source software. My name is Dirk Riele. I'm a professor of computer science at Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. I'm a professor in the computer science department. I focus on software engineering, building large systems, and have a particular focus on open source software. We look at that not just from a technical perspective, but also from an economic perspective. I can do that because I long worked in industry for many years before I became a professor about 10 years ago. So as you are well aware, digitalization is in everyone's thoughts. This guy, a Silicon Valley egghead, self-proclaimed egghead, Marc Andreessen, put it succinctly in 2011 by saying software is eating the world. By that, in my interpretation, he meant that software is the driving force in digitalization and everything is getting digitized. Meaning all products in one form or another, all business models for all products have to incorporate software. There's almost no product left that does not incorporate software and thereby has to deal with it. In addition, software is an ever-expanding frontier of new software-only products and business models built around it, and that is how software is eating the world. To this, I would like to add that the first derivative is often ignored. Software itself has such a high innovation speed that people are changing existing product architectures to incorporate more software, because in software with so-called continuous delivery, you can turn the economic value, you can turn the actual work, the labor of programming something into the economic value it generates as part of a product out there in minutes, if not seconds. So this really is a game changer for products. Now, we all know who benefits from it. These are the largest companies in the world, according to Wikipedia, first quarter of the last 4 years. And you can see that the largest companies in the world are all American. And they are also all software companies, almost exclusively software companies with multiple additional services. But software, therefore, it's not only that it's American companies, it's also that it's software companies who are the richest and most highly valued companies by stock market capitalization who are leading this. So how did this come about? Well, it comes about because of the high profits that the software industry can acquire by being in every product and by generating something called vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in occurs if you depend on the products of a particular vendor because it's an important product component for you. And the switching costs to an alternative solution are so high that you're just not doing it, or that if you were to do it, it would just cost you dearly. In the extreme case, you can't switch because there's only one solution owned by a monopolist. In the classic case, in the 90s, this used to be Microsoft Windows. There was software vendor lock-in into Microsoft Windows because you could almost not do something else but buy from Microsoft by Windows. The consequences of vendor lock-in are dire. First of all, if it's close to a monopoly or a monopoly, the license fees will explode. Why? Because the vendor can. It's a profit-for-profit company, so they will try to raise prices as much as they can. As you depend on that vendor and they have little incentive to work for you because there's little competition or switching costs are so high, innovation blockage is high. you cannot change the software, certainly not in the closed source case. So you're stuck with something, and if you have ideas on how to be more competitive and need to change the software, you're out of luck. So then, the interesting thing is the software industry itself realized that this vendor lock-in can be a problem. The software industry is, of course, Microsoft and all the other vendors, but all the other vendors realized how, say, with Windows, they also became dependent on it. So hence came along open source software. Historically, open source software was not an invention by the software industry. It's initially a volunteer effort, but quickly the software industry realized that open source software is a tool for fighting monopolists. So what is open source software? Open source software is just software given to you under an open source software license. And a license is an open source software license if it gives you certain rights, which must be you're allowed to use free of charge the software. You can get the software in source code form and modify it for your own needs. And you can pass on, distribute the software in unmodified or modified form, again, free of charge. So that is, by a legal definition, open source software. It's important to notice that it's also a collaborative effort of many people. So there's a second association here, which it's also collaborative work. Now, the software industry realized open source software is a tool to keep the monopolists of its own in check. And who would be interested in doing that? Well, everyone in the software industry who is not the monopolist. So let's look at this simplified example. Let's assume you're providing a business application. Let's assume you're SAP. And your customers are buying your business suite for running its business processes. The customer also not only needs your software for the business processes, they also need an operating system, and not shown here, they need a database and many other things, but let's keep it simple. They need an operating system in addition to your software. So then the customer has to buy both operating system and business software. And depending on how much alternatives there are and how powerful you are in the market, somehow these two vendors, SAP and Microsoft, split whatever money can be got from a potential customer. Now, SAP, looking at that, can argue, why is Microsoft Windows so expensive? And I'd rather have the customer spend more money on the business software. Maybe we can raise prices, or maybe we can sell more modules. So SAP is interested in creating competition for the operating system that is also needed in order to run its business applications. So for that reason, a vendor, business applications or any other application really that needs an operating system, has an interest in having readily available open source software, which is a competition to closed source operating system, because as a competition it lowers prices, and then specifically if it's open source software, comes at a cheap price point of operating it in the end anyway. So by creating competition for anyone else in the so-called technology solution stack, a vendor can acquire more of the budget of a potential customer. So say SAP again has an interest if all software in the world was open source software except for its own. Because then all other components, all other software that a customer might need will be cheaper than the existing closed proprietary versions. And this does not only extend to software, but to any complementary product. So for example, Intel, selling you processors and hardware, has an interest that all software be free, more or less, because then more money would be left in a customer budget for its hardware. Recognizing that open source is a tool to keep monopolists in check happened with Linux. So IBM was the last company to try to develop a competing operating system with OS/2 in the 90s, failed against Microsoft Windows. And then they all put work into Linux, and Linux is now a competing operating system solution to Windows. For that, everyone in the software industry, originally without Microsoft, created not everyone, but many created the Linux Foundation to have a playing field and fair and equal playing field in the form of a non-profit foundation to support the development of Linux in order to keep a monopolist in check. Today we see it with Amazon Web Services being very dominant, about 50% of the cloud computing market. We see how vendors pool together in the OpenStack Foundation to create at least the competing software to operate large-scale clouds. And we can see it with Office, the industry banding together, supporting either Apache for OpenOffice or the Document Foundation for LibreOffice to have an alternative to Microsoft Office. So wherever there's a budding monopolist, which might threaten to eat up all the customer budget, the rest of the industry by now will follow this playbook and band together and put quality open source software against that potential monopoly solution. How do you develop open source software? Well, jointly, because it's costly, and if things fail, that would possibly be too risky for a single company. To do it in such a way that it's sustainable, you usually create a foundation, a non-profit organization with a governance which allows you, which gives everyone fair rules and equal playing field, so there are no hidden pitfalls. You need a foundation so that people can invest safely in the joint development of open source software. Open source software does not make revenues go away. Rather, revenue is shifted into complementary products. Most notable, if there is an open source software, money can be earned by providing support services and support for the open source software. IBM Global Services, a consulting organization, is a big supporter of open source software because if customers want open source software to be used, that will be cheaper than proprietary software, and hence more money will be left for paying the consultants of IBM Global Services. However, it doesn't have to be a big consulting firm. Actually, any local, small or large consulting firm can support the open source software. And because there are low barriers to entering the market around the true community open source software, customers can switch the consulting firm or the service and support firm more easily, which keeps prices low. The consulting price is low and reasonable for the open source software. You can see that by looking at who funds these service and support firms, which are nobody. They usually earn their own money directly. Venture capital is not interested in service and support firms around community open source software because no outside returns are possible in a market with low barriers to entry. From an economic or a political perspective, that's fabulous. Open source plus local services are a great step towards maintaining or reacquiring digital sovereignty. Again, it doesn't mean money goes away. After all, the software industry itself invented the model of community open source, fully supported and is leading now the model of community open source software put against potential monopolists. But what they do now is to make money with complementary services or products, which can be closed source software, which can be just computing power like Amazon Web Services, running, orchestrating the servers on which the software runs. It can be specialized hardware like Google's tensor processing units, which run their open source TensorFlow software at higher speeds and more successfully than others. Can be data. All of these intellectual properties come with exclusion rights. So here again, lock-in into a vendor is possible. Open source software doesn't solve a problem, doesn't make vendor lock-in go away. It just shifts it into complementary components if you're not careful. But with the combination of open source software and local consulting services, you can reacquire some of that independence. So this leads us to the key insight of how you can help your own economy, which is that you should create and support openness where your company is lagging, where you're behind the competition. Think about it. This is actually a two-step. The first step is to realize if you support openness, for example, by supporting open source software, you're taking money out of a segment for which the open source software is being developed. So by making something open source software, you're lowering how much money can be earned in that space, which means, however, that complementary products are those where more money is earned. So this works very well to prevent that money flows out of your economy for those components that you wish were open, had a low price point, but aren't because there's a monopolist in that component. So opening up some component, having an open alternative to some closed monopolist component prevents that the profits for that component flow to that monopolist, usually outside of your economy. And by supporting openness, you simply take the money out of that market and let your own companies apply the funds, for example, for innovation elsewhere. That innovation can be in software by commoditizing some layer of the technology stack, some component. You reduce the money that can be made there, but you allow other companies, including your own, to build on those components. Basically, you give your own companies a chance, a second chance. The dice are thrown again and again and again as you commoditize by opening up or by supporting the open source software for those components where otherwise a monopolist would earn monopoly rents. So the innovation is just being pushed out in a frontier, in an ever-expanding frontier in this world of increasing digitalization. How do you actually make that happen? Well, looking at where certain countries are, companies often do not understand these dynamics. So if you're a policymaker, you can have some efforts to educate companies about these mechanisms and how open source and open source collaboration can help them. You can be more specific by supporting in a generic or specific way open source foundations. It's one thing to understand the economic mechanisms behind open source. It's another thing to actually collaborate or sponsor the development of open source software. For that to succeed, you really need to have a foundation, because that's how you define that fair and equal playing field that gives companies a good feeling that their investment will not be wasted, and it removes bureaucracy, financial hurdles, etc. And of course, you need to have a workforce that is able to openly and collaboratively work across company boundaries. So here are two examples, recent examples, German examples. The open consequence non-profit foundation, a cooperative these days, was founded about 10 years ago with my help. That's when we got going. Took a while to incorporate. And it is developing, it is sponsoring, it consists of energy network operators who manage the last mile to your home. In Nuremberg, Germany, it would be energy. They manage the energy distribution networks, and they needed new software for the smart grid because in Germany there's a lot of energy now flowing back from the houses into the system, and this is all not well supported by software, and they did not want to go to their established closed source vendor and its Lockin and its high prices. They decided to band together German energy distributors and jointly sponsor the development and manage the development of open source software for their needs. They did it all by themselves. They took the hard way of learning everything by themselves. In our research, we found that indeed good consultants and community managers can go a long way of making things run more smoothly. This is the second example, the OpenMDM project, which is an industry working group of the Eclipse Foundation, but effectively acts like its own nonprofit organization, is a consortium of German automotive industry players who are jointly sponsoring the development of test data management software for the production of cars. So again, this is not a product they sell, they just need this software for their own operations. They would usually buy it from a commercial vendor but didn't like the potential lock-in. So they decided we need to band together, we need to take money out of this market and have good open source software that we run on. So here the automotive supplier, the automotive companies put appropriate money in and are getting now the software they need for their purposes. This phenomenon of non-software companies, remember, initially I talked about software companies fighting the monopolists in their own quarter. And now I'm talking about users of software who sell something completely different. They manage the energy or they sell you cars. They are also developing now the software they need for the business to work. And this is a more recent phenomenon, so we are sampling those. This is part of our research, and it's everywhere. It's happening everywhere. It's the libraries, it's the bioinformatics, it's the higher education, it's the energy, it's the healthcare domains, all of which are looking to jointly develop or sponsor the development of open source software because they are fed up with the vendor lock-in they get from the traditional suppliers. They want to take money out of the software market and maybe spend it more on their original purpose. Looking towards 2020, where are we with this? The software industry, the high-tech industry itself, understands the value of open source and how to keep monopolists in check very well. There's a lot of foundations, well-funded, where the software companies collaborate and make sure that no single vendor is getting too strong in their own quarter. Of more interest, in particular, if the economy isn't really a software economy, but say sells more hardware or is more traditional mechanical engineering economy, these economies or the companies in those economies don't quite understand open source software that well. There's some understanding, as the previous spreadsheet showed, in those domains. There's a growing understanding, but it's really just a germ, in my opinion, a seed, and there's so much more to be done. Like I explained earlier on, how to educate companies, have foundations, educate the workforce. There are other openness topics. Open hardware is clearly lagging to software. It would be good to not get locked into specialized hardware, which can run software more effectively. And open data, it would be good to have openness in data, in a lot of data as well, to not get locked into data. The same mechanisms apply as to software. Open something up to take the money out of it and make sure You only do it where your companies are weak, so they get a second chance to build on it, and they get a better position for the complementary products to succeed in the marketplace. Looking at this broadly, the less technical, the less engineering-minded an industry, the more it needs these models, these mechanisms explained to them. Summarizing this for digital sovereignty, if you're unhappy with the software and the services you depend on, go open, work on having open source available to you with local consulting, wherever you think it's critical to be sovereign in the operations of your services. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. Here is my contact information. I'll be happy to take comments or answer to your email. And until then, bye-bye.